the
Yeah.
baton.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Philosophy Slam Online Live with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and my good friend and colleague and collaborator and longtime partner in mind, as we were called recently, Mark Vernon. Good to see you, Mark. Mark's a little bit under the weather, aren't you, today? So I might do a little bit more of the talking and Mark more of the abstract musing, maybe in the background.
I'm feeling slightly trippy, so it could be quite an interesting philosophy slam.
It'll be quite an interesting philosophy slam, exactly. And we're just waiting for people to gather, and as they are gathering, let me just remind you of the rules. In fact, there's really only one rule, which is that in the chat function on your laptop or phone, whatever you're on, you are invited to enter one word on any subject that you would like Mark and me to talk about. And the word doesn't have to be philosophy related. It doesn't have to be serious. We have had serious words given to us like death and consciousness and truth and the meaning of life and so on. But we've also had a lot of less serious things asked of us as well, such as most recently denim, I remember being asked about, for example. And here's a first hi. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. Tom is saying, Tom Bales, hi from Ann Arbor. Hello, Tom.
I've been to Ann Arbor. I happened to be driving from the East Coast to Chicago, and we made the unfortunate decision of deciding to stop in Ann Arbor on a football weekend, American football weekend. It was absolutely packed and heaving. So, but very exciting to observe. So I have a good sense of Ann Arbor, Tom.
Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yeah, you're very welcome, Tom. So, Tom, you and others, you are invited to enter into the chat function a single word, and Mark and I will pick it up from there. So, what's that? Hillary Orta says, "Go blue." Is that a reference to the Ann Arbor something or other?
I think it might be. I'm afraid that we're already in terrain that I don't understand.
yeah. We need to exit quickly, Mark. We're onto very terra incognita. Okay, so who would like to kick us off with a single word, which we'll talk about? We're going to be with you for up to an hour, maybe a bit less, as Mark is feeling a tiny bit under the weather. But just enter a single word on any topic in the chat, and we'll see what we can do to... right, and here we go. The very first word in here. So, Miza, wherever you are, thank you for that. UFO, unidentified flying object. And presumably, I mean, we automatically go to... the idea of flying saucers from space. Mark, I know you're not feeling brilliant, but actually maybe this is one you do. I think you're itching to talk about anyway.
I am rather interested in UFOs.
Go on.
I've been reading this book called American Cosmic, which is written by a religious studies professor, and she keeps this sort of neutral ground between neither, kind of dismissing nor explaining so as to, over-explain, and tries to suggest that whatever else you make about UFOs, they have a very palpable impact upon our lives. The most sort of tangible is the book. People in the book, there's one elusive character she calls Tyler D, and he is a very, very successful entrepreneur who, in biotechnology and also space flight, and has claims to have received all his best ideas from extraterrestrials. And in this book, the interpretation is something like, the kind of practice that someone might have used in the past to receive insight, be creative, a kind of emptying of the mind and seeing what came in, has now taken on this very tangible technological form, because particularly in the US, we're such a sort of hyper technological society. So, things like information are now proposed by many scientists as a basis for reality. The fundamental stuff is neither matter nor mind, but is the exchange of information. And although information, I think, is much misunderstood in the way the physicists use it, it does leave open plenty of scope for the exchange of information across strange dimensions.
Yeah.
But what's so remarkable is that millions of people have had UFO encounters of one sort or another, and so the psychotherapist in me just says this is worth investigating.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Well, it's interesting, and welcome if you're just joining us on Philosophy Slam. You might be picking up the idea, which is essentially you just write in the chat function a single word for Mark and I to riff on, and it doesn't have to be serious. The first one we've had is UFO, which Mark has been talking about.
We should, of course, say aerial unidentified phenomena now. Since the hearings before Congress, UFOs become a bit, it's been cancelled.
Okay.
Aerial unidentified phenomena is supposed to be a bit more neutral.
Okay.
Doesn't quite have the ring there, does it?
It doesn't. It reminds me of that phrase in the book by Don DeLillo called White Noise, where he talks about the airborne toxic event, which is about some mysterious fog, really, that descends on the town. But I want to connect this UFO thing that's come up with this another word that was put in there, which was the word disbelief, because one of the first things people say about UFOs is, do you believe in them or not? And this, you might know as well, Mark, recently they've been doing some more research on the Loch Ness Monster. I think I sort of bracket the Loch Ness Monster with UFOs, which like, do you believe in
Shame.
And we've got one that's just come up, imagination too.
Good one.
Because I think there is a connection between the belief in UFOs and the belief in God. I say this partly to wind Mark up, because he's a former priest, as some of you might know. Because in a sense, what we're craving with UFOs, as with the Loch Ness Monster, is something empirical that we can all point to and say, yeah, look, there's the photograph of Nessie, or there's the photograph of the Loch Ness, of the UFO or AUP, and now we all know. So we can shift from faith to knowledge. But it strikes me, and you'll know this from Kierkegaard and others, that what makes religious faith faith is precisely the fact that we don't have empirical evidence. We don't have directly scientifically verifiable proof of the existence of God. Therefore, it becomes a matter of faith. And we got Sean has put in dragons. Maybe dragons have fallen into the same category as God, the Loch Ness Monster, and UFOs. But that's interesting that we're on the cusp between these two things with UFOs. We've got a little bit of evidence, but not quite enough to be scientifically established. So we're in this uncomfortable space, which for me is very like that of religious faith, which is faith rather than evidence. And of course, the whole thing about religious faith is precisely that you believe in the absence of evidence. And that's what creates the risk around it, really.
So I would insert into that dualism another word that's come up, which is imagination, because I think that we do have capacities that can, as it were, see over the horizon or kind of around the corner, can articulate more than might be known by evidence. I mean, this is, hardly a great claim, because any kind of rational argument, for example, isn't justified by empirical evidence. There's other criteria used. And I think imagination is the capacity we have to see into potential spaces. And then we can see how far those potential spaces take us. And if they open up reality more and more, if they are a creative place to be, then we can know that they're connecting, touching with reality. Whereas if they aren't, they're what Coleridge would call sort of mere fantasy, perhaps entertaining, but they're not taking us anywhere very far. And so I think, the imagination has got to be factored into these discussions about what's real as well.
Yeah, well, imagination was one of the words put in the chat by James there. And you mentioned Coleridge. And I'm always struck by Coleridge's definition of the imagination in the Biographia Literaria. He says there are two types, if you remember it. There's a primary and there's a secondary. And he describes secondary imagination as what we normally refer to in everyday life as the imagination, which is the capacity to make shapes in our mind, essentially, to come up with things, unusual pictures, images, fantasies, and so on. And that's a sort of human-generated form of imagination. But he then says there's a much more theological notion of the imagination. And his definition of the primary imagination, I remember this because I had to learn it for my finals when I was doing English literature. The primary imagination for Coleridge is the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now there's a mouthful. full marks to me, by the way, for
Yeah,
remembering.
no, I'm impressed.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
always get in a tangle when I try and get it in the right order.
Yeah, no, it's almost impossible. Well, what he's basically saying is that the original act of imagination was God's creation of the world. Like, what could be more imaginative than that, basically? So, if we are then poets or artists, what makes our work imaginative in the primary sense is the more it repeats this original act of creation by God, effectively. So that's, it's a pretty big ask.
But that's why it has traction in reality, as it were. That's what grounds it and makes it not mere fantasy. That
Yeah,
it is part of, well, as William Blake, who met Coleridge, put it, nature is all imagination. So when we look out at the world, we're seeing the unfolding of this imagination.
yeah,
Yeah. Hey, look, can I just jump in and pick up another word which
yeah. Go
glanced
ahead.
by, which is the word dragon, just while we're in this space?
Yeah, go
Because I actually had a rather strange experience with a dragon the other day.
on. As you do.
No, when I do this kind of form of meditation where I just let whatever comes up in my mind come up in my mind, but I make note of anything that seems a bit strange, or I don't normally think of that. And a few weeks back now, I was doing this, and the image of a dragon came up in my mind. And it sort of rose above the horizon in my mind, and I thought it was a bit strange. I don't actually recall ever seeing a dragon internally, but made the note. And later in the day, I was with a group of people, and we were talking about an app that helps calm children. And essentially, what this app does is that whenever biomarkers from the child indicate that it's calming down, images of dragons appear on the screen.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I rather liked that. It was rather a good synchronicity. I like synchronicities. And
Yeah,
of course, I was sort of I'm not very good at it, but I was sort of meditating, and so kind of being a bit calmer. And yeah, so
so
there
the
were
dragons
even
as well.
dragons can be wrapped in and treated with some serious questioning in the philosophy slam.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'm going to connect dragons to Afterlife, which is another word that flashed up, and I've noticed a few others. White hole, gardeners. I want to come back to gardeners because a dragon is a sort of also mythical as well as a real creature. I mean, the Komodo dragons are real, but they're things you'll slay on the way to a realization, particularly the finding of the Holy Grail. And that would be the ultimate end of a journey, end of a quest. And I'm going to relate that to the notion of the afterlife because the Grail, the Holy Grail, among other things, is a promise of life after death. But the phrase afterlife itself reminds me specifically of an essay by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Mark knows I'm very keen on Jacques Derrida. It's an essay called Survivre, which means both to survive and to live on, to living on. And he has this remarkable argument, which is basically that we already have an afterlife even when we're alive. And he says, how is that? You might say that's a very odd argument. How is that possible? And he says, well, in various ways, but one of the key ways is that we have a name. So, Mark has a name. His name is Mark. My name's Robert. Everybody on the call has a name, but they're identified. And he says the very fact that we have a name and that the name can be remembered after we've died suggests there's a bit of us already living on, even in our living, that we're already surviving ourselves. So the moment you're named, you're surviving yourself in a way because you're being extended or projected into the life beyond your physical body. He also says something similar about memory in general, but kind of the name is already a marker of our afterlife. To have a name is to have that which can be remembered once we're gone. And because it can be remembered even in life while we're alive, even when we're absent, he says every name is kind of marked with our death, but marked with a kind of living beyond our death at the same time. So,
Yeah, the in between spaces, just staying in that sort of both and rather than either or, sort of shutting it down. I mean, the thing that came to my mind when you were talking there was, we're both very interested in this systemic kind of therapy called family constellations. And what happens is that someone represents usually a person, but maybe a facet of life in someone's system. And that representation can be of someone who has died as well as someone who's still alive. And you don't need to be around family constellations very much to witness how people pick up information from people who have died that is veridical. You can sort of test it. I remember one experience I had. I was representing someone who had died, and I had quite a powerful pain in my chest. And then the person whose issue it was said, "Well, you know, they died of a heart attack." So these experiences do happen. What I think complicates the issue is, and this is what reminded me when you're talking about memory there, Derrida's thoughts on memory, is that it may be that we live in sort of fields of memory. And so rather than this being evidence of the afterlife, it might be evidence that we're more porous to memories of others and so on than we're inclined normally to assume. And that this practice of family constellations, amongst others, just sort of drops us into a slightly deeper perception of things.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
nice. Oh, the adiaphora. Well, I might even have to look that up, but I'll come back to it. I want to pick up on the Tao or Tao
Yeah.
comment, which came up earlier, because you mentioned constellations and systemic work. I know very, very little about the Tao and Taoism in general, but I do know a lot of it is about, you know, going with the flow and enabling flow in your life. And it seems to me that what enables flow often, you know, people talk about the state of flow, letting go, getting out of your own way is a thing that comes up in sort of Taoist related or Taoist informed philosophy. A lot of what enables flow is letting go of things. And certainly in systemic work, in family constellations and other practices like that, the our imperative really is much more about getting rid of things that we've taken on inadvertently and got used to carrying and handing them back to the people they really belong to. You know, so instead of taking on somebody else's issues, it's best to own what's ours and give back what isn't ours, and then we can kind of be in flow. It's almost as if the path is discovered the moment we become disburdened of something. So, I mean, again, I'm no expert in Taoism, but it does seem to me that that's consonant with that idea, that it's more about, although we like the idea of accumulating experience, and, you know, we become more established in the world and more real and kind of heavier with reality as we grow older, probably. You know, at the same time, we might be picking up things which don't properly belong to us and slow us down. And it's often the case well, I'm sure you see this in therapy a lot, Mark, with your clients. People will just attest to a rather vague sense of, you know, I'm stuck, or, you know, I can't make progress, or I can't get anywhere, or I don't know how to fulfill my potential, as though they've just got to exert themselves harder rather than releasing themselves from something that might actually belong to somebody else, or they've inherited out of kind of loyalty or love for somebody.
I think this is very fascinating, you know, because it's about experience in a way, and what we make of our experiences. And I think we're very inclined to privatize experience nowadays. And I think, you know, it's my experience. I need to have this experience. I don't like that experience. And there's a lot of reason for that. You know, we value the personal for very good reasons. But maybe an overemphasis on what's just mine leads to this accretion of experiences that are sort of too much to bear almost. And whereas a more Taoist notion, certainly I think in the Xuanzi, he talks about how a kind of letting go, and now he just exists in the Tao, which isn't to say he doesn't have a life. He really does, and has experiences and so on. But he's sharing in a much wider experience, and so the the experience of life is much more in the moment, and so passing through experience, and so there's not this sort of sense of clinging or holding on or being weighed down anymore.
Yeah.
But what we have to sort of get over, I think, is the sense that our experiences are just conjured in our heads or maybe in our bodies, but actually we live in a kind, again, a sort of field maybe or sea of experience that's kind of carrying us along, and our task is to know how to participate with that.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this at the minute because I think, you know, in therapy it's it can help people perceive a sort of wider context, and that can be very therapeutic in itself.
Mm. Yeah, I like that a lot, Mark. I want to come back. I want to ask the person who put in adiaphora just to give us a definition. It's not a word I'm familiar with. I don't know if Mark, you know what that
I
is.
did actually Google,
Oh, you did. Oh, you.
and
I don't
so it
think
means
that's the
difference. It
rules,
means
by the way.
difference.
Huh?
It means difference.
Oh, okay. Oh,
So it
it's
must,
different
yeah,
answer.
it must be
Okay.
not the same or something, because a in Greek normally, yeah. Anyway,
Yes, I should know that actually. When I was talking about Derrida, that's where, of course, he refers back to that when he's constructing his notion of the differing and differentials of time. But anyway, I want to come, and I do want to come back to it. But the word "self-made" really struck me because this morning I had a meeting with a man who is the very definition of the self-made. So this is a new client. I do work with family businesses, and he has made many millions of pounds in his life, having come from nowhere, absolutely nowhere. It's a true rags to riches story. Very charming, likable man. But and as I was talking to him, what it made me realize is that behind every self-made person, there is probably a systemic drive or loyalty or something which has got them going. Uh, thank you for that. Adiaphora means things that are neither right nor wrong, morally or spiritually. Okay, so it's about that in between state that Mark was talking about a bit. Thank you. But in his case, because I was really trying to probe, what's his motivation? Because the idea of self-made almost sounds like you just sprung up on the earth and fashioned your own destiny out of nothing. But in his case, it was very much to make his father proud because his dad had been a similar sort of self-made type, and he wanted to show he could do as well as his dad had and make his dad proud. And it's very affecting to me to listen to this man who's, you know, pretty seasoned in years now, and see how moved he was actually speaking about that. So, self-made is one, and I used to run a whole series of events with, entrepreneurs and high net worth individuals, and in all cases, though they were self-made in a context of saying something to somebody else in their system. Look, I can survive, or look, I'll be okay without you, or look, it was terrible then, but it's going to be okay now. So self-made, it doesn't quite capture the agenda that people internalize from the context that they've grown up in. So I found that very interesting.
yeah, it reminds me of some work that I've done with the children of self-made individuals, when they become adults, not as children, because high net worth individuals, people with lots of money, often the children get into trouble with drugs, or become
Mm,
depressed, whatever it might be. And I think there's a kind of next generation version of what you're talking about there, which is, in a way, if someone in your system is so brilliantly self-made, how can you possibly live a life? And so resorting to things that anesthetize or dull, or take away that pressure in some way, is quite
yeah,
a common experience.
yeah. And just to say, if you've joined recently, we are in the middle of Philosophy Slam. Mark Vernon, and me, Robert Rowland Smith. You can put in any words you like in the chat function, and we'll attempt to react to that in some way. I'm going to go right back to the very third word we had, which was the word justice. And I've been thinking about this a lot too recently, partly because I was reminded through a South African friend of the process after apartheid began to be, well, sort of dismantled in South Africa, a process known as the Truth and Reconciliation uh, Commission. Now, I wasn't on the inside of that, so my information is a bit secondhand, but what I found so interesting about that was that rather than that being an exercise of crime and punishment, which are the two axes really of justice, that was a process of um, just allowing people to say what had happened. I did this to this person. I was the perpetrator, or I was the victim. This is what happened. And that was supposed to be therapeutic in and of itself, but it was an expressly non-judicial process. And again, in the kind of systemic work, Mark, you and I do, it really helps to have judgments. You're bad, she's evil, or whatever. sort of much better to say things like, I'd rather see you than judge you, for example, because so much of, I mean, they say justice is blind because it's acting without prejudice, but I think it's also blind in a deeper way as well, because I think when you begin to see somebody in the round, and this goes to the word holistic, when you begin to see somebody in the round, the more you know them, the harder it is to judge them. Actually, you see, good and bad. You see their experience, you see their stories. I'm sure you see this with your clients, Mark. It's sort of very hard actually to say this is a good person or this is a bad person. You just sort of see how they've evolved a narrative or a way of being that kind of works for them.
Yeah, I mean, my thought, which resonates with what you're saying, I think, when the word justice comes up, goes back to Aristotle. My PhD was on Plato and Aristotle and friendship, and I've always remember reading Aristotle saying words to the effect of "justice is failed friendship," and
Ah,
it's
yeah,
always struck me as a very sort of powerful idea, and maybe because of what you're saying, that if you have to, Aristotle basically thought that any society does need processes of justice, but not because justice is an ideal, but because friendship fails. And in a way, the processes of justice, as well as sorting out the immediate problem, need to carry the capacity to reinstate friendship in the society. And I guess that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was trying to do,
yeah,
not turning a blind eye to what had happened, precisely not actually, but not so as to judge ultimately,
yeah.
but so as to re-establish connection.
I didn't know that, Mark, and that's a fantastically thought-provoking definition. Justice has failed friendship. I'll take that away and meditate on it. Um, I'm going to pick up on nihilism, but just to say, we can have less heavy subjects in here. We've had, justice, disbelief, imagination, and so on, the afterlife. We've also got gardeners and hipster here I want to pick up on. But just a quick word on nihilism, always a topic that fills me with joy, to come back to our very first word. I think the best definition ever of nihilism is that of Heidegger when he's referring to Nietzsche. So Heidegger has, I've got it behind me here, this huge, extensive, I think it's 4-volume, at least 2 massive volumes he wrote about Nietzsche. And he's trying to tease out nihilism in Nietzsche. And the definition that Heidegger comes up of nihilism is the wasteland grows. So it's not a word, it's actually a sentence with a verb in it. So the wasteland grows, which is a sort of I mean, I remember the first time I read this, the hair sort of stood up on the back of my neck. It's absolutely terrifying. The wasteland in and of itself is a shocking, apocalyptic, disappointing, grave, dehumanized scenario that you entertain. The idea of a wasteland growing and the kind of deepening into nothing, I think probably he's thinking of that notion of the abyss in Nietzsche. That the worst thing about nihilism is the expansion of the nothing. It's not the sort of the stability of the nothing. It's the infinity of the eternity. It's a bit like, I suppose, a definition of hell. It's the sort of the eternity of the openness of the loss. That loss is unremitting in some way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it makes me think about the history of the word. And I wonder whether the reason why it's the expansion of the wasteland is because I think that, say, before the modern period, just for the sake of argument, people, I think, definitely had experiences of nihilistic emptiness, the abyss. I mean, it's actually quite a common experience that's described by mystics, but it was situated within a broader path back to God, and in a way, the void then was the recognition that one's own capacity to understand, to experience, to know, know intuitively as well as imagine, and as well as rationally, is limited. We're limited, finite, mortal creatures. But certainly in, say, Christian mysticism, um, the void is worth going towards because on the other side of the void is the God that speaks back. and so it's a necessary part of the spiritual process.
Mm.
Whereas now, of course, that's not an assumption that can automatically be made, and so we're just left with the void. And Nietzsche, of course, makes this famous remark about we've killed God, and we're
Mm.
uncoupled, we're floating in empty space, we've wiped away the horizon, and so on.
Yeah.
So these dark experiences that people undoubtedly have got nothing greater than the human imagination to hold them anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does relate a bit to Nietzsche's notion, because he essentially says you've got to look into the abyss in order to move beyond it. And I was also thinking, as you were talking, you mentioned mystics, of the dark night of the soul, St. John of the Cross, the idea that actually, yeah, there is no, the path to, let's call it enlightenment, for want of a better brief word, is not always a path of light. It is a path of loss and trouble and sorrow. And I was thinking of the Slough of Despond, in medieval literature as well. It's you don't come out into Eden, without travelling through some pretty dark places. Which actually gets me back to the notion of gardeners. I wanted to pick up on gardeners. I'm reminded instantly of one of my favourite pubs, the Gardener's Arms, which is in Oxford on Plantation Road, where there was a plantation, not a plantation in the more ominous sense, but a plantation as in a kind of garden nursery. And it's now a vegetarian restaurant as well, which is rather nice touch. But I do, often think of Milton's notion of the gardeners in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve as gardeners, and this idea that the garden really does seem to suggest this idea of a perfect life that we somehow lost. And I was reminded yesterday of this book, Station 11, which is a post-apocalyptic book, it's about a pandemic. It's very prescient, where people come down with this awful disease. It wipes out nearly all of humankind. And it's referred back to as, the Great Collapse, or the collapse. And when I was thinking about it, reminded of it yesterday, and I was also thinking about it because I gave a talk a few weeks ago on the notion of trauma, and that trauma might be not just something that individuals experience, but maybe as a species as a whole. Perhaps we have experienced some kind of primary loss in some way, because it seems such a trope in literature, in myth, in the structure of the psyche, that there was a garden, paradise. And the word paradise, if I remember this right, is an Arabic word for garden. That we've lost it, but there was a garden in some ways, and it was beautiful, and we had everything we needed. But now, through our own agency, through our own free will, we made some choices that have lost that for us. And a lot of life is about sort of trying to recover it. It's funny, maybe because I'm getting older, I'm becoming more persuaded of that idea, rather than thinking it's a stupid, nostalgic idea.
Yeah, no, I was involved with a project a couple of years ago that was looking at human origins in an evolutionary context. And the sort of head scientist for it was Robin Dunbar, a very well-known
Yeah, I know that.
evolutionary biologist,
Mm.
and actually evolutionary anthropologist, I think. But anyway, and in a way, the project was an attempt to reassert another tradition of human origins, which is to stress much more that we're Homo spiritualis before we're Homo sapiens or Homo faber or whatever else you want to substitute, our name. And this is the sense which the project was to try and gather the evidence for that for long stretches of our Homo sapiens evolutionary history, and then our predecessor homos as well, particularly heidelbergensis, and then Neanderthalis have this sort of parallel track. We lived in a sort of place which was one, more or less of abundance,
Mm.
um, and that therefore our evolution wasn't actually shaped so much by the struggle to survive, but was rather shaped by what's sometimes called offline activities now, rather than just online activities, which was the imaginative exploration of the world, and that technology is a byproduct of this capacity to explore the world around us. through story, through ritual, through altered states of consciousness. You know, the distinctive feature of Homo sapiens is that we became very adept at intentionally exploring the world consciously around us. And so I really like the project because it was a sort of inversion of the normal, very utilitarian, instrumental account of human origins, which is all about survival. Saying no, but maybe for quite a long period of time, survival wasn't the primary question. It was clearly a question, but it wasn't the primary question. Instead, was one much more based on imagination, curiosity, exploration, participation, engagement. And so Homo spiritualis was our ancestor, much more than certainly Homo faber.
It's interesting you say that. You know, I've been thinking of, there's been quite a lot of stuff recently about Darwin, as we know, and I've been struck by just the degree to which Darwinism really has seized, certainly Western consciousness, as the almost unquestionable model. And by the way, I'm not about to make an argument for creationism here or anything like that. On the contrary, I mean, you know, I believe in evolution, you know, for the record. But, and I see the word Nirvana come up there, which I definitely would like to touch on. But at the same time, you know, I think there's all sorts of reasons why we should begin to be a bit more questioning about some of the elements of Darwinism. And we know the inflection of Darwin through people like Lamarck, you know, justified extraordinary acts of sort of white supremacism and racism and ultimately Nazism in the 20th century. I was listening to a program on the radio the other day about, you know, Darwin's absolute assertion that, you know, the male brain was different from the female brain in animals, and it was, you know, it was more, you know, instrumental and stronger in character, and the incredibly sort of heteronormative models that Darwin has about nature, where there's, you know, all sorts of research now about, you know, how that isn't true. So I'm glad to sort of hear you say that, but I never thought about it at all in those terms, because the evolutionary theory also gets us to think about the evolution of humans in purely functional terms. You know, what was the best thing to make our lives work most efficiently for the sake ultimately of survival? And in fact, in this book, Station 11, I mentioned, you know, the mantra in that, the motif is, you know, survival isn't enough. There's no point being a human being just to survive, you know, or to adapt to survive better. There has to be, I like your word, Mark, there has to be the sense of higher exploration or participation or imaginative embracing of the world. That seems to me critical here. That's the way the wasteland becomes a garden, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, nice. No, I think that's absolutely right about. I mean, just the fact that you had to frame it by saying, "I'm not about to declare I'm a
Yeah,
creationist," shows you how political this all is. Actually, it's not just about discussion of the science; it's very, very political. And you know, figures like Richard Dawkins, who wrote a brilliant book in a way, "The Selfish Gene." But if you can be sure about one thing about Darwinism now, it's not as Dawkins relates it in The Selfish Gene anymore.
yeah,
And systemic biology, all
yeah,
sorts of new ideas. And the point is, they're really interesting and exciting ideas. My go-to person, if anyone wants a sort of a really mainstream but iconoclastic evolutionary figure, is Simon Conway Morris. And he was the professor of evolutionary biology at Cambridge, and made very great contributions to evolutionary theory, developing it, diversifying it. But he's written a number of, his latest book was called 7 Myths of Evolution. And he's very much trying to carve out this sort of post-political space where you can question Darwinism without immediately being condemned. You know, it's really important for the science, let alone anything else.
Yeah. We just had another book recommendation, Hugo Simberg, Garden of Death, by the way, and Sean's just come in with Epigenetic Adaptation. We can go there in a second. I did want to pick up on Nirvana. My youngest daughter is studying The Wasteland at the moment, the T.S. Eliot poem. And one of the sections of that is called the Fire Sermon. And the Fire Sermon is a Sanskrit text that's taken on into Buddhist literature. I don't know if you know this, Mark, maybe you do. But it's really a meditation on the notion of nirvana. But nirvana in its original sense, if I remember correctly, nirvana comes from a Sanskrit word, nibbana, which means to extinguish, like to put out the flames, literally like a fire extinguisher. So it's not about enlightenment, it's actually about extinguishing. Well, the fire sermon itself goes, it's like a sort of incantation. What is on fire, O priests? The eyes are on fire, O priests. The eyes are on fire with wanting, O priests. What is on fire, O priests? The hands are on fire. What are the hands on fire with? The hands are on fire with the, wanting to touch, and so on. And so the whole sermon is about how we literally burn these things away, because, as you know, in Buddhism, the holy truths say that the origin of all suffering is in wanting or desiring. All suffering can be related to that. So nirvana is the practice of extinguishing those flames, essentially. So although it's now translated, nirvana is a state of bliss, or indeed the rock band, it's, it has its origins in something quite different. And it's probably not dissimilar to what you were saying about the spiritual experience of kind of letting go of things before you can move on, this kind of burning process. There has to be a sort of caustic moment before there can be an alchemy or some transfiguration or transformation.
Yeah, no, there's parallels in Christianity. My God is a quenching fire. And I think that this discussion is beginning to re-emerge because of psychedelics and the awareness that psychedelics doesn't always go well. It can produce very difficult experiences. But I think that what's got forgotten is that the spiritual quest does produce difficult experiences, and psychotherapy carries that as well. But what we need is a wider worldview that can account and so hold difficult experience. And when you return to the origins of words like nirvana, you feel some of that. It's not just a sort of one step into bliss at all.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make a very peculiar jump back to the word hipster from what you just said. Because if part of nirvana is becoming detached from things, or setting fire to things, having this ritual burning, it strikes me that hipsters like emos or goths or steampunk or whatever the tribe is you belong to a tribe by attaching yourself to its symbols and artifacts. So if I'm a hipster, there may be some very, we can also mention them, you might have your coffee, you might have your fixie bike, you might have your laptop, you might have your beard, whatever, but you do attach to a certain set of symbols, practices, even phrases, words, as well as places you'll frequent too. So the process of identification into a tribe is all about one of attachment and not one of detachment. I mean, on the basis that also you might have separated from another group in order to join the next one. I mentioned my teenage daughter a moment ago. This is an obvious point really about teenagers. I don't know how young the youngest clients you ever see, Mark, is, but just to be reminded again of how much teenagedom is that transition from being attached to a parental system to creating your own system. You're putting one aside to become something else, and how strong the attachments can be for teenagers as they really invest in becoming a, whatever it is, a goth or a hipster, or because that's the only way you can secure the detachment is to make an equally strong attachment somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the word that just came up there, by the way. I was talking.
No, that's very good. I mean, just to mention epigenetic adaptation, I guess that the person who put that in was fully aware that this is another one of these areas in evolutionary biology that is both very fascinating and throwing spanners into the works of old theories. Dennis Noble is a person to check this out. Controversial, but mainstream evolutionary biologist, and he is trying to make the case that genes don't just mutate randomly and then get selected by natural selection for their fitness, but that actually, if you look at the way that genes mutate, there's kind of telos going on there. There's there's deliberation, and so that epigenetic adaptation is part of that. This idea that the sort of top-down effects on genes, as well as just the sort of bottom-up redistribution of genetic material.
Yeah, very good. So we're entering our last phase of our philosophy slam, and I think we touched on most words. We had TGIF earlier on, which I assume is thank God it's Friday. So let me just, yes, thank you, Mark. Let me just touch on that, because I was having a look the other day at Troilus and Cresside, which is the text by Chaucer, the slightly less well-known text by Chaucer, which is a sort of love story, essentially. But one of the things that marks that out, even more than the Canterbury Tales, is the degree to which Chaucer, as a man of his time, sort of roughly contemporary with Dante, not exactly, but very broadly speaking, was so concerned with what today would be called astrology, but in his time was called astronomy. They didn't really have a distinction between the two. And the way their text is set out is literally kind of matched against the phases of the moon and the sun. And I was thinking about this phrase, thank God it's Friday. You know, why is Friday? We know because it's the weekend. That's the obvious sense in which it is. Because Friday is connoted with Venus. You know, French makes that obvious. Vendredi is the day of Venus, and you know, on the day of love, which is Friday, we might go out and search for a mate. You know, we might go out in the evening, you know, to a bar or something. And
I think you can call him a lover, Robert, not a mate. I think you can say a lover.
Okay, anyway. Okay, I love her. Thank you. So, you know, Friday is the day of Venus. It's the day we go and find a lover. But it's sort of quite interesting. I'm quite taken by this idea that, you know, maybe we should have our days of the week more oriented to these gods that decide what they are. So Wednesday, you know, the day of Mercury, for example, maybe that's the day in which we are a bit more experimental, mercurial, try things out. Monday, why, you know, tell me why I don't like Mondays. Well, it's the day of the moon, you know, it's all a bit sort of reflected light. Maybe we're a bit down after the weekend and so on. But it's something tremendously appealing about that idea, you know, whether or not you believe in astrology or not. But
yeah, no, I think that the idea that, I mean, certainly different days of the week have a different quality.
Yeah.
And it's shared. It's not just my personal view of the week and yours that happens to be the same. It's shared. Now, no doubt there's historical factors as well. But no, I very much like that idea of, again, it's this business about, you know, our experience is not just private experience, but it's shared in some way. So anything that opens that up, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I must just say that that's a wonderful thing that you only get on the Philosophy Slam is the move within a sentence from TGIF, Thanks God it's Friday, to Chaucer. And where else would you have that?
Okay, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Well, there's one thing I noticed that I know absolutely nothing about, which is the phrase white hole. I suppose that's the opposite of black hole, is it? Do you know anything about white holes, Mark?
Yeah, so it's a hypothetical object in the cosmos, no evidence at all, but that apart from maybe the Big Bang itself, but it's the opposite of a black hole. So rather than a black hole, which is an object of such density that the gravity is so strong that not even light can escape, the hypothesis is there might be white holes from which emerge all that's got sucked into a black hole somewhere else. So you have wormholes in space.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the. I mean, black holes certainly are very established now, but it's one of those areas in physics where speculation gets quite blurred with actual evidence and empirical discovery. You know, so there's a part of the standard theory of cosmology that after the Big Bang, very soon after the Big Bang, you know, tiny fractions of a microsecond, there was this enormous inflation. And that's used to account for the cosmic background radiation, which actually this is now disputed, but the standard story is that the cosmic background radiation is very, very uniform. Although recent measurements of it have suggested what they call an axis of evil. Actually, it gets very colourful, but it seems that across the plane of the solar system, there are aberrations in the cosmic background radiation. So this is now a bone of sort of contention. Some people believe it's just an effect of the measurements. Others think it's the detection of something real. But anyway, the point is that this inflation, this massive, sudden force that smoothed out the cosmos, no one has any idea what that could possibly be. So it's one of these areas where cosmology is actually very fascinating and flirts. It feels like in-betweenness has been a theme for today.
Yeah, indeed.
But it's adiaphoric, perhaps I could say.
Indeed, yeah, or a matter of a grey hole. Well, listen, I was going to. One of the words here is recapitulation. So in a second, I'll recapitulate by listing the words we covered, but not before mentioning Friday and Robinson Crusoe. We just had a big shout out to Friday and Robinson Crusoe because Robinson Crusoe actually connects back to the notion of imagination. And would you believe it, this idea of being self-made? So let me just make that connection very briefly. I read a book by J.G.A. Pocock, who's a Cambridge historian, some years ago, which made this link, or helped me to make the link possibly, which said, something extraordinary happened around about the time of the founding of the Bank of England at the late 17th, early 18th century. The Bank of England is founded, and at the same time, you get the first works of fiction. So Robinson Crusoe is sometimes thought of as the first novel, at least in the English tradition. What on earth is the connection? Well, the connection is also with that establishment of kind of banking properly. People start to be able to borrow money. This is after the Restoration. The monarchy is very aware that it doesn't want a revolution. Money becomes more accessible to people who don't just have land. Borrowing in credit starts to increase. And the argument is, as people start to borrow money, they can imagine their futures in a way that you can't before, because you simply have your lot in life. You've got the amount of land or money that you're ever going to have, and that's it. But once you can borrow, you can have credit, you can dream, you can have a fantasy life, you can have these literal or imaginary voyages around the world, which are also being supported by the rise of empire and the literal funding of voyages. But imagination in that case goes hand in hand with the capacity to borrow money and to have credit and to invest and to expand your horizon. I was thinking about recently, there's a new advertisement for American Express which talks about, some, typical jingle like expand your world. Or what they're basically saying is borrow money so you can fulfill your dream. But that concept, that trope, goes back to the world of Robinson Crusoe. It's like we can imagine these worlds. They're not just reports, it's not reportage. They're works of credit and credibility, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, as a connection.
That is wonderful. I do love that.
Yeah.
That sort of surfacing of unconscious dynamics.
Yeah.
And you've also, of course, mentioned the monarchy on the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death as well. So,
Yeah.
as a keen monarchist, I'm very glad to have
Yes.
that present.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, we're going to let Mark go, particularly because he's struggled through this a bit, feeling unwell. Let me just recapitulate some of the words we've had. We've had adiaphora, and thank you for that, because neither Mark nor I knew about that, although Mark did do some furtive Googling behind the scenes. We had dragons. We had the Tao. We didn't talk about holistic. We touched on it briefly. The afterlife, white hole, disbelief, justice, epigenetic adaptation, Nietzsche and nihilism, Nirvana, TGIF, hipsters, self-made, and UFOs, which we started with. The only one, maybe I'll leave this as the very final word, the only thing we didn't actually talk about was the first one that came up, which was the word joy. So maybe we can just end by wishing you all a joyful F, as in Friday, and an even more joyful S and S. That's the day of Saturn and the Sun. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again online before long. Thank you, Mark. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert. And thank you for everyone coming along as well. Cheers.